you've ever shed tears because of their voices. Those sacred icons of gospel once brought the black community closer to God, yet they themselves were drowning in lust, some rumored to have been with 4 people in one Easter week. But that's nothing, because here is the list of 19 black gospel legends who were actually the worst lust addicts in history. Stick around until the end of the video to see these artists you once admired in an entirely different light. 19. Inz Andrews. A woman who sang for God but knelt before desire at night. During the golden era of 1960s. Gospel music, when voices echoed from black churches across the American South, the caravan stood out like lights in the dark. Led by holy female voices, none took the audience's breath away like Inz Andrews. Her voice soared, lingering like a scream bursting into the silent night. Each time she sang a line, listeners couldn't tell if they were hearing a hymn or a confession of carnal longing, and she didn't hide it. In a private conversation in 1964, she said directly without hesitation, "I sing like I'm moaning in prayer because at night I live exactly like that." Inz didn't ask for forgiveness. She yearned to be touched, to be desired, to swallow those hungry glances the way she swallowed the high crescendos in her songs. Each tour was an escape from boundaries. She once simultaneously had relationships with 3 pastors, one married, one newly ordained, and one who just preached about virtue before entering her room. In October 1965, the caravan stopped in New Orleans for a 3-night gospel revival at the state's largest church. On the second night, after her voice silenced the entire hall, Inz left the stage in a fiery gaze, her breath still unsteady. She returned to the Baptist Hotel without greeting anyone. Around midnight, a housekeeper opened the wrong door and froze for a few seconds. On the bed lay Inz completely naked between 2 young men, their bodies tangled under a rumpled sheet. One still wore a cross, the other held an unopened bottle of liquor. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. News leaked within hours and the hotel demanded she leave that very night. The pastors at the revival held a private meeting and removed her from the lineup for the final night. After that scandal, Inz continued performing. She sang with heavier eyes as if each note stabbed her own soul. Students recalled that every time she stepped off stage, she would sit alone for hours, head against the wall, breathing like someone who had survived a hunger no one could see. And when she died in silence in 2012, one of her closest confidants whispered, all her life she believed God was watching her. But desire, that never left her, not for one night. 18. Clara Ward. A woman who didn't know the boundary between sacred song and flesh. Throughout the 1950s, no gospel group was more famous than the famous Ward singers. They toured America performing in packed black churches, carrying the fire of faith and Clara Ward's blazing voice. On stage, she stood like a nun in silk, preaching salvation while making men and women alike long to fall into her arms, even if for a night. And not everyone knew with Clara that was entirely possible. She once said directly into a microphone backstage after a performance, "I love men because they make me feel weak, and I love women because they understand what I want without me having to say it." Everyone on her tour knew well that after every night of singing, a new night began. Clara's hotel room was never locked. Some nights 3 people would enter, and by morning only one would leave with red eyes and a shirt forgotten on the floor. She made no secret of it, no repentance. She didn't consider desire a sin. For Clara, sex was also a prayer, only different in that it didn't need a Bible, just flesh. On the evening of June 5, 1961, at the Golden Mirage Hotel in Las Vegas, Clara had just finished a brilliant performance in front of over 1,000 spectators. As people were still leaving the hall, she pulled the youngest drummer of the band up to her room. 2 female fans were also called up a few minutes later. A hotel employee recounted that he was called because the bed was hitting the wall too hard. When he arrived, the room door was ajar and he froze. Clara lay in the middle, sweat still on her chest, holding a glass of champagne, still humming a hymn. That scene was enough to get anyone expelled from any church. But the next morning, she still came down to the lobby, head held high, lips a deep red, greeting everyone with a tired but satisfied smile. In her final years, no one came to her room anymore. The body that had once captivated dozens was now left with unhealed pains and heavy breathing. When she passed away at 48, someone who had once slept with her wrote on a small piece of paper placed under her funeral pillow, "Clara was never afraid of sin. She only feared one thing, living without being able to touch anyone again." 17. James Cleveland. When the hymn couldn't drown out the groans behind the church wall. Have you ever heard Peace Be Still? That song saved hundreds of lost souls, bringing countless people to tears in the night. But did you know that the man who wrote it, James Cleveland, once forced a 16-year-old boy to live in silence for the rest of his life? The main reason was what happened behind the doors James himself had locked with his own hands. He was the one who made gospel music come alive, turned church services into concerts, transformed devotion into explosive emotion. But that was only the part the public saw. Behind the scenes, there was another world, a world everyone close to him knew well. In gospel circles, everyone had heard stories of James always bringing young assistants with him wherever he went. Not just one, but 3 or 4 constantly changing. They didn't play music, they didn't write lyrics. Their job was to be with him all night. A former backup singer once recounted seeing James open his hotel room door in a white robe with 2 naked young men sitting with their knees drawn up on the bed behind him. And then he smiled lightly as if nothing had happened. No one dared confirm that story, but no one dared deny it either. Then in June 1982, no one could remain silent anymore. A 16-year-old boy sued James for repeated abuse. The lawsuit detailed a room called the prayer room, where there was a wooden bed, red pillows, and soft music playing all night. And then James went silent. The plaintiff withdrew the lawsuit. Everything was quickly suppressed, but from then on, the way people looked at him was different. Some churches canceled his performances. Some students left the choir without giving a reason. James passed away in 1991. His death certificate listed respiratory failure as the cause, but doctors knew, relatives knew, and even God knew it was an HIV complication. No one remembers how many songs James sang, but people still remember that in one of his last sermons he softly said, "I only wish I could be forgiven every night, because during the day I can't stop it." 16. Albertina Walker, the woman who fell ill from her bedroom habits. The whole world called her the Queen of Gospel Music, an irreplaceable icon of America's most sacred genre. She founded the Caravans, nurtured countless talents, and guided a whole generation of singers to stardom. Every time she stepped on stage, faith was ignited, her voice both robust and entwined like an old lover's embrace. But behind the dignified facade of a devout woman was a demon that refused to behave for more than one night. Albertina always spoke of temperance. But the truth was, she knew she held a strange power, not just in music, but in her gaze, in her fingers that could tap rhythm on a man's chest, in the way she invited someone to her room after a show with an offer of dinner and tightly closed doors. In March 1972 in Detroit, a 4-star hotel was forced to stop taking reservations after housekeeping found lipstick-stained sheets, perfume spilled on chairs, and a stick of lip balm crushed under a woman's heel. What astonished them was that the 3 people who had just left were not strangers, but a guitarist, a female singer, and her husband. They laughed loudly in the elevator, calling her Mama Wildfire. That nickname stuck to her like an invisible tattoo. In the years that followed, Albertina began to experience chronic lung and throat problems. Doctors attributed it to old age and intense performance, but a close relative revealed that she had contracted a strange sexual bacterium that caused prolonged pharyngitis due to unsafe oral sex in the 80s. She hid everything, only using lozenges and praying every morning. Gradually, her singing voice no longer carried as far as before, but the anguish in her eyes became clearer every day. Her life didn't fade with age, but wore away in silence like a hymn sung off key. 15. Shirley Caesar, passionate nights with younger men. In the early 1970s, Shirley Caesar was hailed as the Queen of Gospel Music. She had a powerful voice and an earnest gaze that seemed to draw the entire congregation back to God. Every time she knelt to sing on stage, people imagined they were witnessing a saint reborn, but who knew that on some nights, Shirley knelt for other reasons in a place with no microphone, no stage lights, only the fervent rhythm of those nearly 2 decades younger than her. Though she always proclaimed herself a faithful wife of God, musicians whispered another name for her, godmother of the band, both literally and carnally. Rehearsals that stretched into midnight often didn't end with prayer, but with muffled moans in the recording studio. A keyboardist once said Shirley didn't like men who talked a lot. She just needed them to keep time and stay silent when she bit their necks. But the most shocking incident happened in 1974 during a performance at a religious convention in Tulsa. Audiences had just left the stadium when the fire alarm rang. People rushed backstage thinking there was an electrical accident. But when security staff forced open the VIP dressing room door, they only found Shirley lying motionless on the sofa, her clothes disheveled, still clutching a leather belt that smelled of cigarettes. Beside her was a musician who had hastily run off, rebuckling his belt, stammering, "I thought she fainted from emotion after the performance." No newspaper dared to mention it, but after that incident, Shirley began to change. Not out of regret, but because she understood she had reached her physical limit. She still sang, still spoke of divine love, but no longer let anyone close after her performances. And in a rare sermon later, when speaking of temptation, she just smiled very slightly, looked down and slowly said, "What makes us fall has never been the devil. It's what we crave our whole lives." 14. Reverend Timothy Wright, the last hymn buried in a smashed car frame. On the evening of July 1, 2008, on a highway near Pennsylvania, Reverend Timothy Wright's car collided head-on with a truck that was swerving. His wife, sitting beside him, died instantly. Timothy was trapped in the front seat, his chest severely fractured. He lived in a vegetative state for over a year before quietly taking his last breath without a confession, without a farewell song. Yet before becoming a name associated with Jesus, Timothy Wright was a living icon of modern faith. He preached on stage and on records, bringing tears to the eyes of those who thought they had lost faith. But outside the church lights, he lived in another world where holiness was just a daytime coat. After prayer, he would often disappear without a trace, then suddenly reappear in unexpected places, old motels on quiet lanes, small recording studios with no instruments, only beds and alcohol. In the summer of 1986, at a Brooklyn motel, cleaning staff recounted seeing him laughing with two young women in the room, clothes scattered and a half-eaten fruit platter resting on a Bible. When questioned, he just smiled, "We're harmonizing." No investigation ever came to a conclusion. The church chose to remain silent, but for many years afterward, whenever he took the pulpit, someone would whisper in the back rows, "Timothy isn't singing for God, he's singing for the things he's trying to forget." That crumpled car carried him away from both worlds. People mourned him as a martyr pastor, but among the crowd, a woman in black bowed her head and whispered, if he had lived a few more years, there would probably have been nothing left to hide. 13. Edwin Hawkins, When the Hymn Fell Silent. They say that on the morning of January 15, 2018, a care facility employee checked the third-floor apartment where Edwin Hawkins lived in his final years. The door was locked, the doorbell went unanswered, and the light still glowed dimly through the curtain crack. When they broke down the door and entered, "Oh Happy Day" was playing for the third time on an old cassette player, and he, the man who once made the world praise faith, lay motionless on the sofa, his mouth slightly open as if to say something he hadn't had time to say. Edwin Hawkins wasn't just a gospel singer. He was a gentle storm that swept through the hearts of even those who didn't believe in God. When "Oh Happy Day" rang out in 1968, America was torn by war and racial discrimination, but his voice seemed to draw heaven closer, making both white and black people cry in a makeshift church. He became a symbol, a hope faith poured into every note. But that was only during the day. At night, only those who had worked with him dared to whisper. Edwin often disappeared after performances without warning, without anyone accompanying him. Many times he was seen in parking lots behind theaters, inside cars with fogged windows, where he didn't need to sing, just whisper. An old singer recounted walking into a dressing room in 1973 and finding Edwin sitting on the floor naked, holding two underage young girls, close, his head resting on one of their shoulders, whispering, "Forgive me before I sing again." The incident was never made public. The church remained silent and those involved disappeared. A few years later, Edwin began to avoid the media spotlight. He still sang, still received awards, but every hymn was sung like an apology. No one knew if he regretted anything. Only that at his funeral there was no photo. Only an old tape playing his humming voice, "Oh happy day when Jesus washed my sins away." But this time no one applauded, and no one was sure he had truly been cleansed of his sins. 12. Dorothy Norwood, the storyteller lost in her own story. In the mid-1960s, as the Caravans rose to become one of the most influential black female groups in gospel, Dorothy Norwood stood out not only for her soulful voice, but also for her storytelling ability that left congregations breathless. People said she could turn a story of miracles into a visceral feeling, transform a prayer into an unhealed wound. But few knew that when the lights went out, Dorothy often returned to her small apartment in Chicago, where she lived with a married woman. It was a relationship that, in the eyes of the community at the time, was unacceptable. In the winter of 1968, the husband returned home early. He opened the bedroom door and found Dorothy sitting reading the Bible completely naked, covered only by a thin white sheet like early morning mist, while his wife cried, clutching a wrinkled nightgown. There were no screams, no jealous fight. The husband silently left. But the rumors were different. The story quickly spread throughout the gospel community, leading to Dorothy being cut from a series of church events. She continued to sing but was no longer invited to teach. For many years afterward, Dorothy lived alone in a rented apartment without a partner or children. People still saw her perform, but her eyes no longer held the same light. A colleague once said, "Every time Dorothy sang about forgiveness, I always felt she was forgiving herself endlessly." 11. Reverend James Moore, the man who prayed amidst physical ecstasy. James Moore was not just a vocalist. He was an icon. Every time he sang, he made thousands of black people kneel, believing that miracles would come, that God's love could heal all wounds. But at that very moment, he was nurturing an unhealed wound within himself. He lived alone, unmarried, childless, but around him there were always young men, musicians' assistants, or simply strangers he met by chance after a performance. In May 1984, at a Cleveland hotel room, service staff found him unconscious and naked, surrounded by two unidentified young men and a pile of male enhancement pill wrappers. Immediately within the church, a quiet investigation took place. After the incident, James Moore began to lose shows contracts and was gradually avoided by large churches. Diabetes gnawed at his body for the last 15 years of his life. He gradually lost his ability to walk, then his eyesight, then his voice, the only thing that still made him feel useful. Before his death in 2000, he lived in a dark room, windows always closed with no visitors except a nurse. She recounted that on his last night he whispered to himself, "God, if you can forgive, please let me dream of singing again. Just one more time." 10. Tramaine Hawkins, the woman who ignited fire on two precipices. When Tramaine Hawkins stepped out of her marriage to Walter Hawkins, her husband and a gospel icon, she didn't collapse as predicted. On the contrary, she shone brighter than ever. Her performances sent shivers down the audience's spines, as if every note was drawn from her bare chest. But from then on, another door opened, a door leading to wild nights that she herself called the sweet punishment of loneliness. In August 1982, at the Parkview Hotel in Oakland, Tramaine was secretly photographed leaving a room with a young rapper not yet 20 who had once called her his musical godmother. That scene spread like wildfire within the strict gospel community. Performance contracts were canceled. A major religious event in Atlanta removed her name from the list. The entire gospel music world turned its back on her overnight. In the years that followed, Tramaine toured small halls, nameless churches. Once, while performing in Memphis, she unexpectedly sat down mid-song and burst into tears. "I'm not asking to forget," she said into the microphone. "I just hope that one day I can remember without feeling ashamed." After the age of 50, she became a pastor, but she never returned to the big stage. On the day she died in her small house in San Leandro, hundreds of letters were found from young people who had lived reckless lives, written to her after hearing her sing. 9. Walter Hawkins. When prayer collapsed in the darkness. He is still remembered as a genius in gospel music, the one who brought new life to the Love Center choir. But beyond the stage lights, Walter Hawkins lived with an insatiable hunger both in music and in bed. Though he was married to Tramaine Hawkins, he frequented discreet nightclubs in Oakland where male dancers knew his name better than churchgoers. One summer night in 1987, police found him semi-naked with a young dancer in his Cadillac parked right in front of the church. This news never made it to the papers, but it circulated among gospel circles for years. Later, he shifted to melancholic music, living a private life until his death from cancer. At his funeral, no one dared ask about those lust-drenched nights, but everyone knew. 8. Reverend Klay Evans gifting Bibles to each lover after confessing with the body. Each of Klay Evans's sermons lasted for hours, making congregants feel touched by heaven. Yet after these tear-filled sermons, he would often retreat to his special prayer room, where it was rumored that many women knelt not to pray to God, but to satisfy him. In 1979, a church secretary accused him of exploiting confession to seduce at least 5 women in just 1 month. Each was given a signed Bible, both a promise and a threat. The church council quietly settled the matter. He continued to serve as pastor until his death, but from then on his eyes were no longer serene, and parishioners were always divided. Was he a man of God or a man of unnamed temptations? 7. Dottie Peoples caught caressing a young dancer in the back seat of an SUV. By day, she was the angel of the South, a golden voice that brought people to tears. But when night fell, Dottie Peoples lived as if every night was the end of the world. In the 90s, she maintained 4 relationships simultaneously: a pastor, a drummer, a young dancer, and a married man. In 1996, one Sunday morning in Atlanta, a cleaner found her naked in the backseat of her SUV with a dancer under 25 just hours before she was due to sing at church. After the incident, she disappeared from the stage for 3 years. When she returned, her voice still rang out powerfully, but listeners heard more clearly than ever. Something within her was constantly begging for forgiveness. 6. Willie Neal Johnson attacked on stage by 2 pregnant lovers. They called him the cowboy of gospel, and not just because of his wide-brimmed hat. Willie Neal Johnson had a reputation as a man with uncontrollable sexual desires. He fathered children with 7 women, most of whom were members or staff on his tours. In April 1981, after a performance in Texas, 2 women unexpectedly rushed onto the stage to confront him, one a backup singer, the other 6 months pregnant. Both claimed he had promised to marry them. He neither denied nor apologized. Instead, he continued to sing, continued to travel across America with his hymns as if no one had ever been hurt. When he passed away, a strange memorial service took place. 3 women, all former lovers, prayed together for the soul of the man who had broken their hearts. 5. Reverend Milton Brunson, a sacred carnal relationship lasting over a year. Milton Brunson stood on the pulpit like a saint, but behind his office door he lived as if faith and desire could coexist. In 1985, a young 23-year-old congregant unexpectedly committed suicide, leaving a letter detailing a sacred carnal relationship lasting over a year with the pastor himself. She wrote that whenever she cried after prayer, he would pull her into his arms and whisper, "This is how God touches you." The church quietly compensated the family. No one was ever convicted, but the gospel community never forgot. He was still honored upon his death, still called a spiritual guide, but somewhere in every compliment there was always a whisper, "He once touched the sacred, and he defiled it." 4. Vanessa Armstrong hit by a pastor's wife with a shoe on stage. Not only did she shine on stage, Vanessa Armstrong was also notorious backstage for her deadly charm. Her list of lovers ranged from pastors, rappers, to music producers. She once claimed she couldn't live without men looking at her as if she were a miracle. In 1992, after a performance in New York, a woman rushed onto the stage and threw a shoe at her face, calling her a demon in an angel's disguise who seduced my husband with tight dresses and sermons. The incident shocked the gospel community, leading many churches to boycott her. However, Vanessa didn't disappear. She returned strongly with songs about salvation, asserting that God loves even the wayward. But backstage people still whispered, "She's the apostle of lust. No one sings about true sin like her." 3. Reverend Paul Morton naked video with a female parishioner leaked from pastoral office. Once dubbed an icon of holy marital love, Pastor Paul Morton, father of famous singer P.J. Morton, often preached that marriage was a sacred gift from God. But in July 2000, a leaked video exposed the truth. In the secretly filmed clip, he appeared completely naked, passionately embracing a young woman, reportedly a close congregant, right in his pastoral office in New Orleans. The incident led him to cancel numerous sermons, withdraw from the media, and shift to a behind-the-scenes role. Since then, he has no longer appeared with his wife at community events and avoids all questions related to maintaining purity against temptation. It seems he chose silence as an unspoken confession. 2. Reverend Al Hobbs forced young female employee to have sex for radio airtime. Then she mysteriously disappeared. As the head of the National Gospel Association and wielding media power across the eastern United States, Reverend Al Hobbs was once lauded as a trailblazer for hundreds of young singers. But behind the microphone, he was a man who always hired personal secretaries with soft voices, short skirts, and under 30. In 2001, a young female radio employee filed a complaint accusing him of forcing her into sex multiple times in exchange for airtime. But while the matter was still under internal investigation, the girl unexpectedly withdrew her complaint, disappeared for personal reasons, and could no longer be reached. Though the scandal subsided, public opinion in the media world never forgot his slippery gaze and constant phrase, "Just let me handle it as long as you know how to please adults." When he passed away, many quietly breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, it's over. 1. Reverend Robert Lowe Sr. secretly had a relationship with his 17-year-old niece. The founder of the gospel group Spiritual QC's Reverend Robert Lowe Sr. was once a symbol of faith in the southern United States. But after his warm sermons, he was truly an old man obsessed with carnal desires. In 1990, he was accused of repeatedly having a relationship with the 17-year-old niece of an elder in the same church, a young girl who used to call him Great Uncle. The incident caused a stir, but no one dared to prosecute due to his immense influence, and the girl's family chose to remain silent, fearing it would ruin their family's reputation. He was isolated for nearly a decade, living quietly amidst chilling whispers whenever he passed his old church. Before his death, he quietly handwritten an unpublished book titled Praying Amidst Sin, with a dedication to one who was never old enough to fully understand adult sins. You've just read about 19 gospel legends, people who saved millions with their voices but couldn't save themselves from carnal desires. They succumbed to temptations they themselves preached against. But that very fact makes us realize they were also flesh and blood humans with all their struggles and silent pains. If you want to know more, rarely told truths in black music hit, subscribe to anticipate the next stories.